Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and it is my privilege to be your haunted host for this episode. Two Dutch women embarked on a journey of a lifetime in the spring of 2014. Their destination? The incredible Central American country of Panama, where they had meticulously planned a trip filled with education, service, and adventure. Kris Kremers Lisanne Froon, best friends, had been diligently preparing for this trip by saving up their wages earned from working at a cafe to treat themselves to a well-deserved break after completing their post-secondary studies. After bidding farewell to their families in the Netherlands, they arrived in Panama on March 15th, 2014, eager to explore and enjoy everything the country had to offer. The pair spent approximately 2 weeks touring the region, enhancing their Spanish skills and immersing themselves in the local culture. Subsequently, they ventured to the town of Boquete, a quaint settlement nestled deep within the western mountains near Costa Rica. Boquete is renowned for its breathtaking natural wonders, including picturesque trails that wind through the rugged terrain, providing visitors with pristine views of the lush, tropical jungles. Situated at the Continental Divide, the town allows one to witness water flowing in both directions, westward to the Pacific and eastward to the Atlantic. Another prominent attraction is the dormant volcano that looms nearby, the highest point in all of Panama, attracting numerous visitors eager to savor the spectacular vistas from its peaks. However, undoubtedly, the most captivating feature is what locals refer to as the cloud forests. Due to its elevation and atmospheric conditions, Boquete's valley and forests frequently trap clouds, creating an eerie yet intriguing ambiance. The perfect setting for a truly baffling mystery. The two were drawn to the small town for another reason: volunteering. The women had traveled to Panama not only to search for adventure in the jungles, but also to provide some assistance with a Dutch volunteer organization that focused on the education of children. Although they were still learning Spanish, they felt well equipped to volunteer some of their vacation time to help out. When they showed up in Boquete, they were told that their anticipated start date for volunteering had been pushed back. It was unclear to the women how the mistake had occurred, and they were a bit upset by the sudden change of plans. Since there were no volunteer openings for them yet, they had to hang tight in Boquete until something cleared up in a week or two. Ever the opportunists, the women decided they would take advantage of their unexpected time off and experience the local landscape. They spent the first couple of days walking around, getting to know a few local townspeople, and doing a few shorter hikes into the surrounding jungles. What happens next is one of the most haunting, strange disappearance cases we have ever encountered. But before we get to that, as far as we're concerned, the spooky season has arrived, and we have a whole host of Halloween season fun for you to enjoy. In Toronto, we have 4 ghost tours, as well as our Haunted Harbor and alone in the dark experiences. In Ottawa, we have our final season at the Ottawa Jail. We are returning as well to the Bytown Museum, the oldest building in the city, for our Haunted Museum tour, as well as 3 other ghost tours on offer. In Kingston, our original Haunted Walk and Ghosts of Queen's University tours will keep Kingston creepy this October. If you live a little further away and want to get in on the fun, we have our Haunting at Home online paranormal adventure and our virtual haunted campfires featuring some of the best ghost storytellers in the world, all of which can be enjoyed from anywhere in the world. For tickets and information about our spooky season fun, please visit hauntedwalk.com. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, all at Haunted Walk, and follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen so we can keep growing the Haunted Talks community. On April 1st, the women decided to take a bit more of an ambitious road and see the volcanic peaks up close. Following breakfast with some fellow Dutch travelers, they set out on their journey. They opted to go alone, without a local guide, for reasons that remain unclear. But they did take a local dog that belonged to one of the families they had befriended. As the day drew on, there was no sign of the women. The trail had a few different paths, including a much longer, winding trail where you could easily get lost. Still, no one really began to worry until darkness fell and their local dog suddenly returned to the town, alone, without Kris and Lisanne. The search effort began almost immediately, and worried family members who couldn't get a hold of the women quickly coordinated with the Panamanians. Within a few days, there was a group of people, including their parents, combing the jungle, looking for any signs of where they had gone. A reward was offered, but still, nothing. They had simply vanished. Then a few months later, in early June, a woman found a blue backpack near her property, which she turned in to the authorities immediately. In what seemed like a big break for the case, the backpack clearly belonged to Lisanne and contained a lot of the women's personal items, including their cell phones. But still, no sign of the women themselves. Critically, the discovery of the backpack redirected search efforts away from Boquete and closer to the village of Alto Romero, a considerable distance away in the adjacent province. Soon, Kris's discarded denim shorts were found on a rock, and not long after that, the first sign of bones. In all, over the course of a few months, over 30 bone fragments were discovered, scattered in the riverbank. Later testing determined that the bones belonged to both women. They had finally been found. Many people believe that the simplest and most logical explanation had proven correct. The 2 women had somehow become lost or injured on their hike. Unable to find their way back, or perhaps overcome by the elements, they quickly perished in the unrelenting jungles of Central America, while their remains and belongings were scattered by scavengers and natural forces. And that's where the story ends. Open and shut, cut and dry, right? Well, not quite. There were many unexplained and frankly creepy things about this story that just don't fit neatly into one explanation. As much as people have tried to find a simple explanation, there just isn't one. There are plenty of bizarre theories, some bordering on the absurd, all attempting to explain why there are so many oddities and unanswered questions. But none fit completely. Coupled with the scarcity of clear information on every detail of the case, and the possibility of the Panamanian authorities withholding some evidence, this is one of the creepiest unsolved mysteries out there. So let's rewind and consider some of the things that make this story stand out. When people die suddenly, there are only a few explanations. An accident or illness, being overcome by the elements, or foul play. While the first two have always been possibilities in this case, some began suspecting foul play, or at least some very eerie human elements, shortly after Lisanne's blue backpack was found. It was discovered a considerable distance away from where the searchers were looking. A good distance from the trail the women were supposed to be following upwards towards the volcano. The backpack was found beside a riverbank during the rainy season, when the river was overflowing with water. The villager who found it had claimed the backpack had recently shown up there. It was not sitting there for the previous 10 weeks, and certainly didn't look soiled or worn. We could assume the backpack had been carried to the location by the current of the water, or at least submerged in the water and gradually pushed to the side. However, the contents of the backpack, including the electronics, were all in working order. According to reports and images available online, the backpack was in near perfect condition. No evidence of having been out in the wilderness for over 2 months. So, how did it get to that location? Inside the backpack, there was a decent amount of cash, a passport, water bottle, women's bras, and sunglasses. Relatively ordinary things, but supporting the theory that the backpack stayed dry and out of the elements, or else those contents would have been destroyed. We can also imagine that if there was a human element involved, it's surprising that the cash would still be there in the bag. Both Kris's and Lisanne's phones were in the backpack, suggesting that the two women were likely together for a good period of time after whatever incident happened. When the authorities were able to access the contents of the cell phones, they were in store for another mystery. On the day they went missing, both phones attempted to call emergency services. Due to low reception, neither of the calls went through. They were made just before 5 p.m., when there was still sufficient daylight. No other calls were made that first evening. The next day, a total of 3 calls were attempted, and one seemed to connect very briefly to emergency services before disconnecting. There's evidence one phone was left on for the entire night of April 2nd, and then turned off the following day. By April 4th, that phone, which had belonged to Lisanne, ran out of power. But the other phone periodically tried to check for a signal over the next week. The correct PIN was never entered. but evidence shows that the phone was looking for some kind of signal a few times during that period. By April 11th, 10 days after the women went missing, the phone was switched off for the final time, even though it still had 22% of its battery remaining. For some, this evidence clearly showed that the woman must have gotten lost or encountered some kind of accident during their hike. After one phone went dead, the other one was used until something finally happened on or around April 11th. However, for others, some of that just doesn't add up. How do we explain the incorrect PIN numbers? Sometimes no pins were entered, but there was evidence the wrong pin was attempted a few times. Many are certain that Lisanne and Kris knew each other's pins and could have used the phones if the other one was incapacitated. If one was deceased, or they were separated at this point, who was accessing the phone? Why were there no recordings made or photos taken to provide some evidence of their whereabouts? This was back in 2014, but both phones were relatively new and had photo and video capabilities. Other than the calls, there is no evidence that the phones were used in an attempt to contact anyone or record anything. But what has really made people question the phone evidence are the truly bizarre photos that were found on the digital camera in Lisanne's backpack. I have posted a gallery of these photos, which are well worth looking at hauntedwalk.com/podcasts, and just find episode 167. By all accounts, this was Lisanne's camera, and it was clear from earlier photos it was in their possession on the day they disappeared. There are photos of the women as they leave on their hike, and then a few of the trails they took close to the Continental Divide. Suddenly, the April 1st photos end, seemingly in the middle of a hike through the jungle. The last photos on the memory card are a series of 90 flash photos taken on April 8th, in the very early morning hours when it was completely dark. Photos depict a series of random and unsettling things. Possibly a river ravine, a twig with plastic bags, a few items on top of a rock, a backpack strap, and the back of Kris's head. A completely random collection. The photo of the back of Kris's head is the only photo that shows the women, so we assume that she was still alive on April 8th. However, remember the phone evidence? Her phone was already having incorrect pins inputted periodically as it tried to connect. Surely she would know the pin to her own phone if it was in her possession. But then, what about Lisanne? Was she deceased by then? Or separated from Kris? Possibly. But then someone else had to be taking the photos, as the back of Kris's head was taken from an impossible angle for a selfie. And like the phone evidence, if the women were still alive, why were they only using the camera at night? Only once, on a single night, a week after they had vanished. For proponents of the accidental death theory, the camera evidence might show that the women were trying to signal for help in the darkness, possibly using the flash to flag down passing planes or respond to voices that they heard in the distance. Or perhaps they were using the flash to illuminate their path at night, as they didn't have any other light source. Or perhaps they were panicking and using it to try to catch a glimpse of something that may have been out there in the jungle. An animal, people, or perhaps even something otherworldly or paranormal. But why did it take a whole week for them to come up with this idea? Surely if they were using the camera strategically, they would have done this from the start, or at least sooner than 7 days into their ordeal. Why didn't they continue this strategy until April 11th? The camera had plenty of battery and memory card space remaining. If they were able to use their own camera, why wouldn't they have tried again the following day or night, especially if things were becoming dire? The next pieces of truly odd evidence are the bones themselves. Remember, they were found over 2 months after the final calls were made on the cell phone. However, the bones that were found were vastly different from each other. Lisanne's bones clearly had some skin still attached to them, and initial testing showed that it was in the early state of decomposition, much different than the rest of the bones that pointed to a mid-June date of death. Kris's bones, on the other hand, were bleached and completely clear of skin. The natural elements can easily bleach bones, but usually that takes some time. And Lisanne's bones, located very nearby, were not bleached whatsoever. The bone evidence actually gets even stranger. A fragment of Kris's pelvis was discovered, and like her other bones, it had been bleached. However, the pelvis of a young person doesn't just break in half. Certainly not very easily, and not naturally over the course of a couple months. It would either take time or force. The tissue that was expected to be on the bones was also missing. Some pointed out that the women's bodies were found near a riverbank, so perhaps the break and missing tissue happened while the bodies were being pushed downstream. The problem with that theory is that there were no visible scratches or abrasions on the bones that would have indicated scraping or friction with the riverbed. In fact, the lack of scratches also potentially ruled out any animal activity and scattering from scavengers. How can bones be naturally dispersed by animals without there being any scratches or marks on the bones themselves? A few unverified rumors have been circulating that make the case even more odd. It was reported that Kris's denim shorts, found before the bones were discovered, were neatly folded on a rock, as if they had been deliberately removed and placed there. But regardless of how the denim shorts were found, there's been no further reporting on the rest of the clothing the women were wearing, except, presumably, the 2 bras in the blue backpack. Where are the other clothes? And why were the denim shorts in near perfect condition found, but nothing else? Others have suggested that additional evidence of a possible encampment was found near the women's scattered remains. But other sources state there was no evidence of human activity anywhere in the nearby jungle. With so many unanswered questions, it's very hard to sort through the verifiable evidence and determine what might be speculation or pure imagination. However, it is clear that a single explanation just doesn't make sense. Let's go through a few of those now. First, the accident theory. It has been suggested that one of the women had an accident during the hike, and the other was trying to find safety and shelter, and both eventually succumbed to the elements. However, we know from the photo evidence that two people were alive on April 8th when the photos were taken, and one of those people appears to be Kris. If one of the women were injured, another theory posits that perhaps one left to go get help. But that raises the question then, who took the photo of the back of Kris's head? Alternatively, if one was injured and they were still together, it's possible they couldn't cover much ground and were slowed down. If that's the case, wouldn't there be more evidence of an encampment or some type of shelter? More obvious calls for help than simply switching on a phone and looking for a signal every couple of days? But the biggest piece of evidence against the accident theory is the sheer distance that the two traveled from their original intended destination. If one of them was unable to carry on the journey or was incapacitated, how did they get so far from Boquete? Similarly bizarre is the lost in the jungle theory. Let's assume for a moment that the women went off the main trail and got lost on their way back from the Continental Divide lookout. They supposedly had a local dog who was very familiar with the trails, but it could have easily ran off or strayed too far and then continued on home. This theory may explain why they were so far from Boquete. Perhaps they got turned around and decided to follow a waterway, which was inadvertently leading them away from Boquete. But if they were lost, and presumably alone, how did the remains end up so strangely placed? Why were Kris's bones bleached, as if they had been left in the sun for days, while Lisanne's bones still had some of the skin attached, and evidence of recent decomposition? They could have perished at different times, but Lisanne likely wouldn't have remained with her deceased friend and simply waited for her own demise. Even if she did, how did Kris's pelvis break in half without any clear scratches or indications of force? Cell phone activity shows that someone was still alive 10 days after they initially set out on their hike. Even for locals familiar with the jungle's terrain and survival, this is a fairly long time to be lost and alone without access to consistent food or shelter. If they were lost, where are their clothes? How did the blue backpack get from where the remains were located to the riverbank where the local woman found it? Remember, everything was dry and in pristine condition, and we know that the camera was in the bag with the women at least 1 week after they initially went missing. The other theory that many have considered is foul play. If the women didn't go missing or get lost on their own, perhaps someone assisted. One of the persons of interest from the beginning was a local guide who had been seen with the women the previous day. According to different accounts, they decided to forego his services on April 1st, or might have booked an alternative time on the following day. Either way, he seemed rather suspicious from the start, and didn't always have consistent stories to tell to the authorities. However, by all accounts, he was around Boquete on April 2nd, and was involved in the search efforts. Cell phone evidence proves that someone was accessing the women's phones in subsequent days. If it was their killer, he could not have been helping in the search effort, which was located in the opposite direction. And then we have to remember the camera evidence. It was clear that at least one woman was alive on April 8th. It's possible that the killer was the one taking the photos that night, and Lisanne was already dead. What was the killer doing the rest of the time? Were they camping out in the wilderness with the women? Then why wasn't there evidence of an encampment or substantial human activity? How were the women held in the vast jungle, where they could have easily escaped? Was the killer going back and forth between their own base and where the women were being held? That would be difficult in the rugged and isolated jungle. Perhaps the woman encountered a completely different killer who wasn't helping in the search efforts and never got on the police radar. Still, the sequence of events doesn't make sense, and the same questions remain. Your head is probably spinning with all of these questions and tiny details, but it's what makes this case so eerie. A lot of people have deep fears about being lost in the woods or jungle, unable to find their way out of a vast wilderness filled with unpredictable obstacles. But there seems to be something more going on. Many have put forward theories, and a very extensive book recently came out about Kris and Lisanne's disappearances that give a fairly convincing account of the accident theory. But even those authors admit that there are some strange things about the case, and some very peculiar questions that defy simple explanations. Not every disappearance is cut and dry, and I'm sure our true crime fans know that there's always little loose ends that no one can quite explain. But in this case, it's all loose ends. It's a case where theories are being developed to try to tie together a disparate collection of fragments that refuse to hold. It's a case that becomes more perplexing the more you read, and just when you think you've landed on the most plausible theory, something else crops up that completely discounts your idea. It's no wonder that this case has baffled investigators, both professional and amateur. As much as the mysteries that surround this case are extremely alluring, we must remember that at the heart of this story are two young women just starting out in their lives, and from all accounts, and from looking at the photos themselves, seem to be fun, good-spirited, and well-intentioned. In the end, the Panamanian authorities could find no conclusive cause of death. So the case sits shelved, waiting for some breakthrough to occur. It may be very tempting for us to say, this case will likely never be solved. But as we know from cases like the Somerton Man and even the Dyatlov Pass incident, given enough time, enough technology, and enough hard work, sometimes answers can be found. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. I am extremely interested to hear what you think about this case, and if any of the theories resonate with you more than others. Please feel free to drop your thoughts on Facebook and Instagram with the artwork for the show. Very eager to hear what you think. And it is time to start making your spooky season plans. So be sure to visit hauntedwalk.com to get all the information about our tours, paranormal adventures, and online experiences. As always, a special thanks to our hard-working Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor, and Brittany Buss, who researched and wrote this episode. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.